Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. So I understand this is an interdisciplinary conference. My perspective is that of political theory. So I'm a political philosopher, although I hope that what I have to say will engage with topics or ways of looking at religion from other perspectives as well. So I'm currently finishing a book about liberalism and religion, and more specifically about the liberal concept of religion. So what do liberals think religion is? And how does it affect what they say about how liberal states can deal with religion? So perhaps to frame the question, we can perhaps begin with what liberals take to be the classic statement of the state-religion connection, which you find in John Locke. So Locke thought that religion is about the aspirations to salvation of the individual soul. The state has no authority to shape or control such aspirations. The state cannot compel inward belief, nor does it have the competence or wisdom to distinguish true from false belief. Therefore, the state should adopt a policy of toleration towards religious belief. The role of the state is limited to the care and protection of, and I quote from Locke, outward things such as money, land, houses, furniture, and the like. In such domains, by contrast, churches are incompetent, and they should not meddle with the business of the state. And Locke famously concluded, what is above all things necessary is to distinguish exactly the business of civil government from that of religion, and to settle the just bounds that lie between the one and the other. End of quote. In contemporary liberalism, this basic intuition of finding the just bounds between the state and religion has evolved into what was being called two-way protection of the state from religion and protection of religion from the state. Okay, now I want to turn to a group of theorists today which ask questions about liberalism's religion, the concept of religion that is at the heart of the Lockean view. And I think it is vitally important that liberal political philosophers respond to this critique. So that's what I'd like to do in this talk, set out the critique and then try to respond to it. So what the critique I call critical religion, hence my title. So the critical religion school, they point to the indeterminacy and inadequacy of the liberal construal of religion itself. So this critique has been developed by an eclectic group of writers, among whom Talal Assad, William Kavanagh, Peter Danchin, Stanley Fish, Timothy Fitzgerald, Saba Mahmood, Elizabeth Shackman-Hurd, Stephen Smith, and Winifred Sullivan. So these are the people I engage with. So they're anthropologists, sociologists, philosophers, historians, lawyers, comparative politics and religious studies experts. And they're all versed in methodologies that openly reject the claims of normative liberal political philosophy, either from a Foucauldian or from a Schmittian or from a post-colonial or for a pragmatist or from a realist perspective. But still, I want to say that they share a claim, and that claim is that the liberal attempt to define what Locke called the just bounds between the state and religion is mission impossible. That's the title of one of Stanley Fish's article. And it's mission impossible because there is no non-arbitrary way to single out and fairly regulate a stable, recognizable sphere of religion. Okay, so I want to spend a bit of time explaining the critique before I try to respond to it. So I think I want to distinguish between three versions of the critique, which I call the Semantic Critique, the Protestant Critique, and the Realist Critique. I'll briefly explain them in turn. So the first, the Semantic Critique, is that there is no stable, universally valid, empirical referent for the category of religion. As comparative historians of religion have shown, religion is a distinctively modern and Western concept. It was born from the 16th century onwards out of a mix of Christian disputes about the truth, European colonial expansion, and the formation of nation states. And this idea, this very modern idea that the world is divided into different religions offering competing ways of individual salvation, this idea was born during the European Renaissance and Reformation. And then European global expansion invented religion in other places. He discovered religion when religion wasn't a term used in other parts of the world. So one example that I sometimes cited, although I understand the scholarship is mixed on this one, but one example that's often cited in the way in which Hinduism was invented as an ancient faith. It was invented as an ancient venerable faith, but in fact that invention took the form of a parceling out of the social life and customs of the people living near the Indus River into their religious and non-religious practices. Quite an artificial parceling out that didn't necessarily map onto their understanding. But what this means is that it's impossible to discern any common core or essence to all the world religions. Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, Shintoism have nothing in common, the claim goes. And there's no feature that they share and that would allow us to distinguish them from other things, as other forms of beliefs or other forms of ideologies, such as nationalism, for example. So the claim here, the semantic critique, as I call it, is the claim that the category of religion doesn't capture a universally recognizable or semantically coherent reality. That's the first claim. Second one is what I call, following others, the Protestant critique. So this focuses on the political and legal treatment of religion, and it suggests that liberal law is biased towards individualistic, belief-based religions. So you find that famously in Talal al-Assad, who argues that the Protestant Reformation in Europe initiated a newly secular mode of political governance, which relies on a set of foundational and mutually reinforcing binary oppositions between the divine and the civil, between belief and reason, between thought and action, and between mind and body. And in line with the Protestant rejection of Catholic ritualism, the emerging secular order sees true religion as firmly located on the first side of each binary. So true religion is about mind, belief, and thought, rather than constituting an activity in the world. Locke, for example, saw religious rituals and practices as, because they were merely bodily acts, they were not essential to religion. So religion, on this modern Protestant reading, is private, voluntary, individual, textual, and it's about belief. And of course, this construal of religion, I think, is recognizable and has found its way in both national and international law and in public discourse. Give you an example of how this construal of religion is widely used in popular arguments defending the regulation of Islamic veiling in Europe. So three ideas I popularly advanced ideas that I think draw directly on this Protestant view of religion. The first is that it's okay to regulate Muslim dress because it only belongs to practices, forum externum, not to belief, forum internum. That's one line of thinking. The second popular argument that you hear is that because veiling is not religiously a religious obligation, is not part of the textual 5 pillars of Islam, and there are disagreements within the Muslim community as to whether it is required by the faith, then that makes it more amenable to regulation because it's not seen as compulsory. The third argument raises doubt about the properly religious dimension of the hijab by arguing that it's not freely endorsed by women and therefore does not express the proper nature of religious belief as voluntary and chosen. So what comes through in these very problematic interpretations of Muslim practices is, I think, a recognizably Protestant construal of what real religion is. So it has to be based on faith, it has to be mandated by a text, and it has to be a fulfillment of a duty. But as Saba Mahmoud and others have shown, a great deal of religious practices, ritual observance, dietary habits, dress and bodily behavior has little to do directly with a choice of faith or sincerity. In Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, Aboriginal religions and many forms of Christianity, practices and community are more important or as important as belief and individuality. Now, one implication, I think, of this Protestant critique is that once the religious experience is seen as a community-based, practice-based, embodied way of life, it's very difficult to single it out in relation to other practices. So it's no longer clear what is special about religion. And you find this line of reasoning in a very well-known book by Winnie Sullivan called The Impossibility of Religious Freedom, where she claims that it's impossible for the law to distinguish between the properly religious and the non-properly religious, and instead she argues for a regime not of special treatment, but of equality. So much for the Protestant critique. And I realize I'm summarizing quite a lot of quite complex ideas in two paragraphs. The third one, I'll come back to some of these ideas in my response. The third critique, the third line of critique is what I call the realist critique. And here this is a more radical critique, and he says liberal regulation of religion amounts either to the naked exercise of arbitrary power by the state or to the establishment of an alternative religion, that of liberalism. So liberalism is the religion that competes with other religions. And there's nothing special about the liberal claim to be superior or to be a judge instead of a party. So 2 ideas here. The first one is that liberalism is incoherent and arbitrary because it constantly produces what it denies. The state is unavoidably entangled with religion, and it's impossible to separate state and religion in the way that Locke hoped would be possible. The moment when the law is faced with deciding which practices or which institutions are religious and which are secular, it engages in precisely those theological exercises that it cannot engage in, and therefore gives up on its own secularity. So the claim here is that all states establish religion, formally or informally. And there's no substantive difference between states such as Egypt and France and Turkey and the USA. They all manage religion for their own purposes to maintain public order. The second and even more kind of radical version of the critique says that secular liberalism is itself a religion, right? So that takes the critique a step further. And here the thought is that liberalism cannot impartially govern the religious because it is a rival metaphysics, or substantive way of life. So liberalism is a kind of secular fundamentalism, and a normalizing project, one that designates heretics and dissidents as unreasonable, which is the phrase that John Rawls uses to describe people who don't subscribe to the political liberal agenda, if you like. And so the unreasonable is a loose rhetorical category that really designates those who do not agree with its own articles of faith. Right? So that's the claim. So I think, put together, there's quite a powerful challenge to liberalism, and I think liberalism should take notice and respond to it. So that's what I try to do in my book. But here, I just want to give you a sense of a preliminary response that many liberals might want to make. And so that's very much the first chapter of my book, was set out how some of the answers are already there in existing liberalism. I still think that existing liberalism has not listened attentively enough to the critique. So that's what I try to do in the rest of the book. But here I'm just going to give you kind of the standard mainstream Rawlsian response to this critique, because I think the critique in many ways misses its target. So I want to show that standard liberalism, Rawlsian liberalism, if you like, is not immediately vulnerable to the challenge, to the three challenges I've just set out. Why? Well, for a simple reason, which is the liberals I'm interested in, I call them liberal egalitarians, they just don't think religion is special in the way that is criticized by others. So if you read the work of, recent work of people like Charles Taylor or Ronald Dworkin or Eisgruber and Sager, who write in the US constitutional tradition, or the late work of John Rawls, political liberalism, it's quite clear for them that they don't talk about religion, they talk about conceptions of the good generally. They don't focus on religion in the way that John Locke can be said to have done. And that's not because they want to downgrade the status of religion. It's not because they don't think religion is important. On the contrary, they want to extend and generalize the protections and burdens traditionally associated with religion, when these are justified, to broader categories of secular doctrine, practices, and ways of life. So this is what is called neutrality in liberal political philosophy, is precisely an attempt to think through what it would mean to treat religious and secular ways of life equally. And you can think of this move as a kind of generalization of the idea of religious toleration. So the liberal state is no longer required merely to be neutral as between religions, but it has to be neutral between almost all aspects of its citizens' conceptions of the good, whether these are spiritual or secular. So this liberalism is egalitarian in two senses. First of all, it's not rooted in a secularist worldview. Right? So it's not committed to the view that the non-religious life is a better life. So it doesn't exclude religious believers from its justification. And in fact, John Rawls hoped that in diverse societies made up of different citizens holding very different conceptions of the good, they could convert, they could agree to live together under political terms of justice. So the upshot is that the liberal state doesn't single out religion as special. It doesn't single out religious views as problematic for the purposes of legitimacy. And it doesn't think of itself as being secular, but rather as being neutral. So it doesn't separate itself uniquely from religion, but rather refrains from endorsing or promoting any controversial or comprehensive conception of the good. The second way in which this liberalism is egalitarian is that it doesn't uniquely protect religious beliefs from beliefs and practices from intolerance, repression, and discrimination. So on that view, religious freedom is just one instantiation of a more basic right that everybody has, a right to personal freedom and or ethical independence. And it's a right that is also at stake in other controversies around conscience, sexuality, and abortion. There is nothing special about religion, such that religious citizens should receive uniquely privileged or unprivileged treatment in the law, say in the form of exclusive exemptions on the ground of religious belief. So what grounds the respect that the state owes to persons as persons, it's simply the human capacity for moral or spiritual agency, whichever way they choose to exercise that agency. So that's really the moral heart, if you like, of that liberal egalitarian conception. Okay, so I've just sketched the main outlines of egalitarian liberalism, which is a dominant school in my discipline of political philosophy. And I like to now think, when we have this in mind, how well equipped is this theory to answer the three challenges I set out, right? So I want to come back to the three lines of criticism I highlighted, and I want to take them in turn. So the Semantic Critique, the Protestant Critique, and the Realist Critique. So starting with the Semantic Critique. So remember that's the view that there's no such thing as religion. It's not an easy concept to define, right? Well, as I think you probably know where I'm going with this, egalitarian liberalism is not vulnerable to this semantic critique because it's really not interested in religion per se. So it doesn't work with a semantic notion of religion. It works with what I call an interpretive notion of religion. So the semantic critique is that there is no such thing as religion. There is no set of features that all religious beliefs, practices, and activities share. But even if that's true, we might want to discuss this, but even if that's true, I want to claim it's not a problem for egalitarian liberals, because the question they ask is not whether the law adequately captures what is ordinarily meant by religion, because from a normative perspective, this begs the prior question, which is what is it about religion that is protection worthy in the law? So what deeper normative values underpin protection of freedom of religion? So this draws on Ronald Dworkin interpretive theory of the law. And the basic thought here is that when we think of what the law does in relation to social reality, the law is not there simply to describe social reality, it's there to protect values that we have other reasons to care about. And so legal concepts cannot be reduced to their semantic meaning. I'll give you an example, just leaving religion aside, but just by analogy. Consider the law of free speech. Now, speech in law, what we mean by speech in the law doesn't necessarily tally with what we mean by speech in social life. So the law of free speech doesn't protect everything that ordinary language calls speech. So libel, for example, doesn't count as speech for the purposes of protection. You don't have a right to label someone else. But also the law does not only protect what ordinary language calls speech. So in the US, if you burn the US flag, in ordinary language, we don't call that speech, but it's actually protected as speech by the law. So this is what I mean when I say that legal and semantic meanings do not overlap, because the law has a specific normative purpose, and not all moral values can or should be expressed by the law. The law has a limited point. So I think what matters is that the law expresses and protects the correct underlying value. And here you might want to say religion is worth protecting because it is about autonomy or integrity or ethical independence. But that's the value that is protected, not religion as such. Now, because egalitarian liberalism does not single out religion as an area of uniquely special concern, it doesn't need to get embroiled in controversial definitions of what religion is. All citizens deserve equal respect as citizens, whatever their particular conceptions of the good. So what egalitarian liberals have done is to generalize the notion of religion to a broader, looser, and therefore less ethnocentric and biased category. Religion is morally and politically salient as one of the conceptions of the good, ethical worldviews, ways of life, etc., that make up the pluralism of contemporary societies. So that's the first answer. Let me move on to the second one, which is the Protestant critique, and the answer to the Protestant critique. So recall the two main strands of the Protestant critique. First is that liberalism singles out religion as special as such, and secondly, liberalism privileges belief-based religious lives. Now, it should be clear by now that egalitarian liberalism is not vulnerable to the first criticism. It is egalitarian, as I just explained, precisely in the sense that it doesn't single out religious believers and groups for special regulation. So religious believers, like everyone, can benefit from basic liberal freedoms, such as freedom of thought, speech, expression, and association. But whatever rights religious citizens have, they have in virtue of a feature that is not exclusive to religion. So if there's a right of conscientious objection from compulsory military service, for example, such a right should apply to citizens with both religious and secular conscientious convictions. Second, the state abstains from endorsing or supporting any particular religion, but only because it doesn't endorse any particular conception of the good. So the state is not secular, it doesn't single out religion, it's just neutral about different conceptions of the good. So as a result, religious believers and groups neither enjoy nor suffer exclusively special legal treatment. They are treated under a broader regime of equality. And that's very much in line, I think, with what Winnie Sullivan suggested at the end of her book, The Impossibility of Religious Freedom. It is a regime of equality. Now, let us turn to the second Protestant charge, the Protestant critique. And this is the idea that egalitarian liberalism is biased against both practice-based and unchosen conceptions of the good. And we saw, and I argue, that this charge is pertinent in relation to public discourse about Islamic veiling in Europe. But here I want to distinguish between public discourse and academic philosophical liberalisms. And I think it's just not true to say that academic liberals do not take religious practices seriously. In fact, liberals have widely discussed the legitimacy of exemptions from law that burden religious practice. So it's not true that they only care about belief, they care about practice as well. So there's been lots of academic literature about religious dress and symbols, Shabbat and Friday prayers, ritual animal slaughter, the refusal of blood transfusions by Jehovah's Witnesses, vaccinations, and so forth. So these are all religious practices. Now, it's true that liberals have disagreed over the legitimacy of exemptions, but not because they think that the practices are not religious. Right? They would say they are religious, but just because they're called religious doesn't mean they should be granted. Right? So that's a normative claim, not an empirical one about the nature of the practice. So I don't think it's fair to say that there is a bias in favor of belief-based, voluntary chosen religious practices in liberal egalitarian literature. Now, there's a complication, though. How about the charge that liberals care about choice and voluntariness? I think it is true that liberals value choice and voluntariness, but not because they think that what is good about religion is choice or voluntariness. their claim is different. I think what they want to say is that choice is what is good about freedom of religion, about the legal right of freedom of religion. So the reason we need a law of freedom of religion is because religious coercion and persecution are bad, not because religion itself is a voluntary choice. So what the law protects is the right not to be coerced into changing or abandoning the beliefs or way of life one in fact has. On this view, it doesn't matter how religious commitments were acquired, whether they're voluntary in a Protestant sense or not, it doesn't really matter, provided people identify with them. So people might experience, we can experience being called by a divine presence or claimed by a community instead of choosing our religion. But as Will Kimlicka pointed out, choice is not important per se. What matters is that our lives are led from the inside. That is, that we identify with our ends and commitments, however these were acquired. Second complication, how about the charge that liberalism protects belief, but it regulates practices? So we still have that distinction between belief and practice, right? And there's still a distinction, I think, that's present within liberalism between the forum internum and the forum externum. Forum externum are practices, and by contrast to belief, because they affect the rights of others, they automatically fall under the preview of the state. That's in Locke. But again, I think it's important to be clear about this. So the liberal state does not regulate forum externum just because it is externum. That's a necessary but not a sufficient condition. In both John Locke and John Stuart Mill, you find the notion that religious practice, like any kind of human practice, can only be interfered with if it injures or harms others, or otherwise infringes on their rights. And that's why, to take up again the critique's favorite example of Muslim veiling, I think very few liberals would argue that there can be any justification for a ban on a practice that doesn't infringe on the rights of others. So I conclude that philosophical liberalism is not guilty as charged, because it's not committed to that implausible view that religion is really about belief, not practices, or that religion has to be voluntarily chosen to deserve respect. All of this, I think, doesn't follow from what liberals try to do. Okay, I move on to the last critique now, which is the realist critique. So I want to come back to the two variants I identified, liberalism as power and liberalism as religion, to simplify, right? So liberalism as power, according to this charge, if you remember, liberalism is seen as a mode of governance, of state governance, which is based on the constant and arbitrary reconfiguration and regulation of religion in the interests of secular state power. So what are we to make of this criticism? So I think critics sometimes write as if state definition and regulation of religion is per se troubling or embarrassing for liberals. But it isn't. The fact that regulation of religion is normative in, you might say, a Foucauldian sense, the fact that it shapes the way that people experience the world, doesn't mean that it's impermissible in a liberal normative sense. So it may be true that, say, Saudi Arabia and France, they both state that regulate religion. It's also true that both, say, the UK and Uganda define and regulate homosexuality. They both do. They have laws about these things, right? But I think it's not good enough to point out that power is everywhere and that everywhere it is normative. I think just ask members of sexual and religious minorities in Uganda and Saudi Arabia. So I think there are good and bad reasons, better or worse exercises of power, and I think critical religion theorists cannot escape normative critique in this sense. They need to give us an account of which exercise of power is better and which is worse. Furthermore, I think critics take the idea of separation too literally. So they write as if liberals, insofar as they're committed to neutrality, are also committed to something like a separate sovereignty view of church-state relations. I'll give you an example of this kind of slide. So Peter Danchin writes, and I quote, "The neutrality thesis is no longer tenable. Rather than withdraw from the religious domain, the modern secular state intervenes and reconfigures substantive features of religious life." End of quote. But I think that this confuses neutrality, that's a normative abstract principle that's grounded in equality, as I explained. This confuses neutrality with separation of state and religion, which is a particular institutional and political framework. Of course, the liberal state intervenes in religious life, as in social life, in myriad ways, and often does so permissibly. So states would extend their fire services protection to churches, mosques, and synagogues. They do not exempt religious officials from the purview of criminal law. They provide financial support to a range of religious associations, schools, and charities. They recognize the cultural and social role of religion. All these activities may breach separation, but I don't think the liberal principle is one of separation. The normative principle is that of neutrality, and these activities may not be incompatible with neutrality. So I need to say a bit more about what neutrality entails in particular cases. And finally, I think liberal critics mistake liberal neutrality for liberal skepticism. Liberals are not committed to value-free neutrality or separation or abstention. Liberalism has substantive commitments. Liberalism is based on the idea that all individuals should enjoy as much freedom as is compatible with the freedoms of others, and that everybody should enjoy a set of primary goods, rights, and opportunities according to principles of justice. This is not an ethically neutral ideal. And so as egalitarian liberals do not embrace skepticism, moral skepticism, they should not be worried by the charge that you find in Stanley Fish, for example. Fish thinks that the state is not neutral when he forces religious fundamentalists to educate their children into a liberal education. This is a comment on a US case called Mozart. It seems to me that such state intervention are not arbitrary violation of non-neutrality, but they're rather a logical implication of liberal political morality. So this takes me to the second realist charge, that liberalism is merely another religion. And you find that in Stanley Fish's work as well. So liberalism, Fish writes, is anything but impartial. It is a notion of the good as contestable as any other. End of quote. So it cannot claim to regulate and arbitrate between diverse religions and conceptions of the good, because it is itself a religion. So it is judge and party, so to say. So how should we understand this? So there are different ways of parsing out the claims, right? So Fish might mean that liberalism is a controversial doctrine. It's not universally shared. I think this is correct, but it doesn't need to trouble us, I don't think. Political liberals try to justify liberalism to as wide a constituency of individuals holding diverse, reasonable conceptions of the good, but no liberal claim that liberalism is uncontroversial. So if this is what is meant by the idea that liberalism is a religion, then I think liberals are guilty as charged, but the charge is trivial. However, Fish might mean something more interesting, which is that liberalism is a religion in a thicker sense, that it's a rival metaphysics and a comprehensive way of life. So it's a direct competitor to traditionally religious doctrines, and it therefore cannot claim to accommodate them fairly. This is a more damaging charge, I think, and it's certainly a valid criticism of one variant of liberalism, the one that would be inspired by Enlightenment ideas of rationality, individual autonomy from religion, emancipation, and substantive secularism, a version that you find in some versions of French laïcité, for example. But this is not the liberal tradition I'm talking about here. Liberal egalitarianism, very much in the spirit of Rawls's political liberalism, seeks to provide a fair framework of coexistence between citizens holding a variety of doctrines, religious and non-religious. And it is not itself grounded in any comprehensive metaphysical, ontological, or ethical doctrine. So liberalism doesn't seek to enforce a substantively liberal and secular way of life on citizens, but instead it affirms political principles of justice, notably the fair distribution of primary goods, such as freedom, rights, and opportunities. Primary goods in Rawlsian parlance are goods that everybody values, whatever else they values. So income, opportunities to work, etc. So the liberal framework promises the fairest way of living together under terms that preserve the equal freedom of all. And I think the onus is on critics. The onus is on critics of liberalism to explain how the alternative, so the imposition by the state of a religion on all its citizens, might be defensible at all. 'Cause there's been no shortage of radical critiques of philosophical liberalism, but few have positively defended attractive alternatives, whether from agonistic or relativistic or truth-based perspective. Now, and I conclude, this doesn't mean, however, that philosophical liberalism is not riddled with tensions. So what I do in the rest of the book, I've just given you the first chapter here, so what I do in the rest of the book is really to take up some of those insights and to follow critical religion's lead. Because I think they're right to suspect that some of the blind spots of liberalism emerge from its insufficient reflection on the concept of religion. And in particular, I argue in my book that the liberal analogy between religion and a conception of the good is unsatisfactory. So I think to defend liberal egalitarianism better, we need to work with a more complex understanding of religion is in relation to political aims, and with a more complex and disaggregated conception of religion and the good. So what I say in the rest of the book is that the liberal state is not and shouldn't be neutral about religion or the good in general. Rather, I want to reflect on the interpretive values of liberalism to pick out the different values associated with religion and the good. So I disaggregate religion into different elements, not simply the vague conception of the good that Rawlsians always talk about. So I talk about sometimes it's conscience, sometimes it's cultural practices, sometimes it's racialized identities in context of discrimination. Sometimes religion takes the form of epistemic doxa. Sometimes it's about norms of justice, modes of association, types of social authority. And we need to do all that work, all that complex work, and show how liberal ideals relate to these different features in different ways. And in doing that, I also try to address what I think are the two main insights that we should keep from the critical religion challenge. And I give them a name. So one of them I call the ethical salience challenge, and the other one I call the jurisdictional boundary problem. And I briefly explain the two, and then I conclude. It's only 3 paragraphs left, so I'm nearly there. So ethical silence is the first puzzle I try to say more about in the rest of the book, because I think critical religion theorists are right to say that liberal egalitarians cannot be entirely neutral about the good. I think we cannot avoid evaluating the ethical salience of different kinds of beliefs, practices, and identities for individuals. One example, one area in which this is obvious is the area of exemptions from the law. It's not enough to say that we respect people when they have conceptions of the good. I think we still need to take a stance as to whether surely it is more legitimate to exempt someone who wants to wear a religious sign, say in a workplace, than it would be to exempt someone who wants to wear a football shirt in a workplace. And as soon as we get into this discrimination between different kinds of commitments and practices, I think the very idea that liberals are neutral about the good should be reformulated. So I want to think of liberalism as having a thin liberal theory of the good that involves special respect for special commitments, which are called integrity protecting commitments. And that allows us to say that wearing religious sign is really more important than wearing a football shirt. So that's the ethical salience problem. The second problem I call the jurisdictional boundary problem. And here I also think critical religion theorists are right to say that liberals need to think about the state and what the state has authority and legitimacy to do. So liberals cannot avoid granting the state the authority to delimit the proper boundaries of religion. As I said, they don't use the word religion because it's not an interpretive term, but they use others. The boundary between the public and the private, between the right and the good, between the personal and the political, between what is about integrity and what is about mere preferences. So all these discriminations ultimately are made by the state. And I think egalitarian liberals are right, critical religion theorists are right to remind us that liberalism need to justify this authority of the state. So states decide whether to allow the Catholic Church, for example, to have an all-male clergy, or states decide to force or not Christian schools to discriminate or not to discriminate against gay teachers. So the states ultimately, and the law policies the boundary of what pertains to it and what pertains to religious groups and religious jurisdiction. So there is a claim of sovereignty at the heart of liberalism. And I think critical religion theorists are right to force us to think about that. But I think they're wrong to think that sovereignty is always arbitrary. So I think we need to think about the importance of liberal and democratic constraints on how states exercise their sovereignty and how they draw boundaries between the public and the private, etc. So really, both these objections, the ethical salience and the jurisdictional boundary objections, they throw doubt on the egalitarian liberal promise of neutrality towards religion. It seems to me that the shift to neutrality that liberal egalitarians have effected over the last 40, 50 years or so, this shift to neutrality doesn't really dissolve the substantive question of where to draw the line between the religious and non-religious. It might not be formulated in that way, but in other ways. And what is how the state and the law should deal with religion, even on interpretive theory. So it seems to me that if we are to defend liberalism, we will have to give up or at least modify some claims made on behalf of liberal neutrality. And this much we will have learned from the critical religion challenge, and I think it is a salutary and important lesson. Thank you.